My mother smiled before the doctor had finished explaining how my daughter might die. Dr. Lena Shaw never said Ivy would be gone exactly 7 days from Tuesday. She said that if my 12-year-old daughter's heart kept weakening at the same rate, and if the treatment continued doing nothing, we might have as little as 1 week. Ivy's heart was no longer responding consistently to the treatment that had stabilized her before. Dr. Shaw refused to give me a precise hour. 1 week was only a warning, based on the direction Ivy's numbers were moving, not a scheduled time of death. I understood her words, but I could not make them feel real. Ivy was awake when we returned to her room, though the medication made her eyelids heavy. She glanced at the monitor and asked whether it sounded different because she had gotten worse. I told her machines were noisy and tucked the blanket around her shoulders, even though both of us knew I had not answered her question. 4 hours later, she asked for ice water. Her lips were dry, and the soft double beep above her bed had worked its way so deeply into my head that silence felt dangerous. I carried an empty paper cup into the hallway and turned toward the family lounge. My mother and my younger sister were standing around the corner near the consultation room. Judith held Stephanie's hand between both of hers. For one foolish second, I thought they were comforting each other. Then my mother smiled. "Finally," she whispered. "In just 7 days, her $1.8 million inheritance will be ours." Stephanie squeezed her fingers and smiled back. "I'll take her bedroom for Caleb. He can stay with Rebecca when he starts college. She won't need to keep a room for Ivy once the girl is gone." The girl was how she said it. Not Ivy, not their granddaughter or niece, and not the child breathing through a mask less than 20 feet away. The paper cup collapsed in my hand. I wanted to step around the corner and make them repeat every word while looking at me. I wanted everyone in that hallway to hear how they had turned a child's prognosis into a financial calendar. Then Stephanie lowered her voice. "I stepped outside after the consultation and called North Coast. They said the final Juniper Vale payment is still scheduled. Once they receive notice that Ivy is gone, the contingent clause takes over." Judith nodded. "Rebecca will be in no condition to argue." "I don't need her to argue," Stephanie said. "I need her not to notice until the claim is already open." My anger stopped burning. It became cold enough for me to think inside it. They were not simply waiting for a tragedy. They were preparing paperwork for one. I walked back to Ivy's room without the water. She opened her eyes when I sat beside her and glanced toward the doorway. "Were Grandma and Aunt Stephanie crying?" "No," I said, smoothing the hair away from her forehead. "They went to get coffee." It was the first lie I had told my daughter in years. I told it because her heart was already carrying more than it should, and I would not place my mother's greed inside it too. Judith and Stephanie came into the room 10 minutes later with flowers from the hospital gift shop. My mother called Ivy sweetheart 3 times, although she rarely used the word when Ivy was healthy. Stephanie asked whether Caleb had ever told her how much he admired her. Ivy watched them with the still, careful expression she used whenever adults were trying too hard. Before leaving, Judith touched the rail of Ivy's bed. "Whatever happens, your life can still mean something for the family." I stood before Ivy could ask what she meant. "She needs to rest." Stephanie studied me for half a second too long, but she followed our mother into the hallway. I waited until the elevator doors closed, then called Amos Bell. He answered on the second ring. Wind moved across the phone, followed by the scrape of a shovel against gravel. "Everything all right at the hospital?" "No," I said. "Please do me a favor." His voice changed as he told me to name it. "Back up every exterior camera, at Juniper Vale and at my house. Save the gate logs. Keep every delivery slip, courier envelope, and contractor work order. If my mother or Stephanie comes, do not tell them I called." After a pause, he asked, "Do I let them through the service gate?" "Only as far as their paperwork legally allows. Nothing leaves. Not a plant, not a file, and not one thing from Ivy's room." "What am I protecting?" I looked at my daughter. She had fallen asleep with one hand curled on top of the blanket, as though she were holding on to something no one else could see. proof that she is still here. My mother and sister believed they had 7 days before anyone could stop them. They were wrong about the inheritance, wrong about the bedroom, and most of all, wrong about Ivy. Before I continue, I hope you are doing well today. Stay with me to see what Amos found. And please subscribe to the channel if you believe no child should have to earn protection from the people who call themselves family. After I ended the call, I contacted Priya Desai, the trust attorney who had helped me understand Beatrice Mercer's amendment after her death in January. I told her only what I had heard. I did not tell her that Stephanie had forged anything, because I had no proof of that. I did not explain our family history. I repeated the exact words, the exact location, and the fact that Stephanie claimed she had already contacted North Coast Fiduciary. Priya did not gasp or promise revenge. Do not confront them. Do not open, move, or alter anything connected to Juniper Vale. Let Amos preserve whatever arrives, and let me contact North Coast. Can they really take the inheritance if she dies this week? Only if Ivy dies before the determination date written into the trust, Priya said. That date is not next Tuesday. It is April 25th at 5 in the afternoon Eastern Time. I looked at the hospital calendar. It was April 14th. That is 11 days away. Yes. If Ivy is alive at that exact time, the final payment goes into her protected subtrust. It does not matter if the bank finishes processing later. If she dies before that time, Judith and Stephanie become the contingent beneficiaries, 1/2 each. So they are treating Dr. Shah's estimate like a shortcut. They may be, Priya said, but wanting a condition to occur and filing a claim that it already occurred are very different things. Let me find out which one we are dealing with. I typed an account of the hallway conversation from the chair beside Ivy, stopping whenever she moved. When I finished, Priya told me she would notify the trustee that Ivy was alive and hospitalized, then request preservation of every call, message, and claim connected to her name. Judith texted before midnight. Your sister and I are only trying to prepare. Please do not make this harder than it has to be. I placed my phone face down. Their definition of preparation had already included my daughter's money and bedroom. I was no longer willing to imagine what else it might include. Ivy woke briefly and asked for the water I had forgotten. I filled a new cup, helped her take 2 small sips, and apologized. She gave me a tired smile. You always come back, she murmured. The words nearly broke me, because that was the promise beneath everything between us. I had come back after every scan, ambulance ride, and nightmare that another family had decided not to keep her. I would come back now, even if I had to walk through my own family to do it. At 8:17 the next morning, Amos called. I signed for an overnight envelope from North Coast, he said. I have not opened it. Who is it addressed to? Juniper Vale Nursery, Attention Contingent Beneficiary Processing. A chill moved through me. What does the delivery record say? Paper rustled on his end. When he answered, his voice had lost all warmth. Deceased beneficiary verification. Ivy Whitaker. I turned toward the bed. Ivy was still breathing beneath the pale morning light, while somewhere outside that room, someone had already reported her dead. Amos sent me a photograph of the unopened envelope while I sat beside Ivy's bed. The courier label showed Juniper Vale's address, the tracking number, and the words deceased beneficiary verification beneath my daughter's name. Amos had placed it on the scarred oak desk in Beatrice Mercer's old office, exactly where she used to sort seed invoices with a pencil tucked into her silver hair. The sight of that desk carried me back 6 years, to the first afternoon we brought Ivy to Juniper Vale. She was 6 then and still wore her coat indoors whenever we visited somewhere new. It did not matter that the greenhouse was warm enough to fog the windows. Keeping the coat on meant she could leave quickly if an adult changed their mind about her. Thomas and I had chosen to foster an older child because we knew how often children past toddler age were passed over. We never told Ivy she was lucky. We never asked her to call us mom or dad. We gave her a room, enrolled her in school, and waited for trust to become something she could feel instead of something adults promised. For months, she kept a small travel bag beneath her bed. Every shirt was folded inside it at night. When she wanted to tape a drawing to the wall, she asked whether the paint belonged to the house or to us. Thomas told her the wall belonged to the person sleeping beside it, but she still used only one piece of tape. Beatrice noticed those things without making Ivy explain them. On that first visit to Juniper Vale, she did not ask whether Ivy knew anything about plants. She handed her a pair of child-sized gloves and pointed toward a picnic table behind the propagation house. "No one has to prove they belong before they get lunch," she said. "You can help after you eat, if you feel like it." Ivy kept her coat on through half a sandwich. Then she took it off and folded it beside her. That was Beatrice. She was my mother's aunt, 22 years older than Judith and harder to impress than anyone I knew. She did not become soft around Ivy. She corrected her when she pulled a tag too hard or stepped too close to a new graft. What she gave my daughter was better than indulgence. She spoke to her directly, as though a 6-year-old deserved the truth without being made to feel small. Ivy adored the nursery, because nothing there was expected to stay unchanged. She once watched Amos prune a young serviceberry and asked why anyone would cut something they wanted to keep alive. "To help it carry its own weight," Beatrice answered. Ivy thought about that for an entire week. As she grew older, she remembered the names of the seasonal workers and which one had a daughter studying nursing. She knew Amos took his coffee without sugar. She asked about root systems, not prices. When donors or buyers toured the property, she drifted toward the potting benches instead of the rare specimens Beatrice displayed for visitors. Beatrice chose Ivy as the primary beneficiary of the final Juniper Vale payment because of that bond, but not because Ivy had performed for it. She had already treated Ivy as family before the amendment existed. Her 2023 amendment moved that payment to Ivy, but did not rewrite every branch of the trust Beatrice had created in 2018. The older family fallback remained in place if Ivy died before the determination date, which was why Judith and Stephanie stood next in line. Priya later explained that Beatrice had deliberately left me outside that fallback so no one could ever claim I benefited from losing my daughter. Beatrice knew my mother and Stephanie resented her choice. She had mistaken resentment for something smaller than danger. My mother and Stephanie never understood the difference. They said Beatrice had been influenced by me. Stephanie once complained that no 12-year-old could manage $1.8 million, as though Beatrice had planned to hand Ivy a check and a car key. Judith said Caleb was the one who could carry the family name forward. She said it during Beatrice's last Thanksgiving dinner, while Ivy sat close enough to hear every word. Caleb had looked down at his plate. A few minutes later, he asked Stephanie whether the deposit for Brackenridge State was due before graduation. His mother smiled too quickly. "Your investment account is being moved to a new platform. Everything is handled." Judith immediately asked Beatrice about the cranberry relish. The conversation changed so abruptly that I noticed it, but I did not understand why. At the time, I assumed Stephanie was embarrassed to discuss money in front of us. Thomas died 4 years after we adopted Ivy, in November 2024. A cerebral aneurysm took him before either of us had time to understand that an ordinary morning had become the last one. Ivy put her clothes back into the travel bag that night. She did not tell me she planned to leave. She simply placed the bag beneath her bed and began asking whether I could afford the house alone, whether her school was too far from my work, and whether children could be returned after an adoption if one parent died. I kept her room exactly where it was. I kept her in the same school and continued our Friday noodles even when neither of us could eat much. Stability did not cure grief, but it gave grief somewhere safe to sit. Our house stood on a separate parcel beside Juniper Vale, close enough to share the old service road but legally divided from the nursery. That was why Amos could oversee the nursery gate and still reach our house within minutes when something went wrong. Beatrice became part of that stability. Thomas had once helped redesign Juniper Vale's irrigation system. So after his death, Ivy continued visiting Amos and Beatrice without feeling that she was trespassing into my side of the family. She could ask Beatrice difficult questions because Beatrice never answered with pity. When Beatrice sold most of Juniper Vale in October 2025, she chose a native plant conservation group rather than the highest bidder. The sale was paid in stages. The final $1.8 million would not be released until the 25th of April 2026, after the buyer confirmed the environmental inspection, plant inventory, breeding records, and the protected mother stock listed in the agreement. Until then, those retained assets had to remain exactly where they were. The mother plants, selected equipment, and variety right records belonged to the trust during the closing period. Most would pass to the buyer afterward. None of them belonged to Stephanie. Amos had been appointed site custodian because he knew every greenhouse, lock, shipment, and inventory sheet. That was why official trust mail still went to Juniper Vale's registered operating address. It was also why the person who reported Ivy dead had wanted the envelope sent there. They thought a gardener would sign for it and place it in a pile. Priya called while I was still looking at Amos's photograph. She had spoken with Elaine Carver, the senior trust officer at North Coast. "Tell Amos not to open anything," she said. "He should photograph the envelope where it was received, preserve the courier record, and keep it secured." "He already has." "Good." Elaine confirmed the envelope was generated after a death notification call yesterday. I looked at Ivy. She was asleep, her face pale against the pillow. "Does that mean someone can take the money?" "No. If Ivy is alive at 5 in the afternoon on April 25th, North Coast places the payment into the protected subtrust Beatrice created for her future. Judith and Stephanie receive nothing." The structure sounded like Beatrice. She had not given Ivy a prize. She had built a fence around a future a child should not have been expected to defend alone. Priya continued, explaining that the nursery's retained assets also had to remain untouched until closing. Moving the mother stock or records could jeopardize the sale itself. "So the envelope is part of a claim?" "It is a verification request. North Coast still requires certified proof and additional review. The call did not transfer anything. It did create a record." I asked whether Elaine knew who had called. There was a brief silence before Priya answered. "North Coast preserves incoming call data. The notification came from the main office number of Stephanie's college consulting company." The room seemed to narrow around me. Priya added, "The caller also asked that the successor beneficiary packet be sent to Juniper Vale instead of your home. Stephanie had not chosen the nursery by accident. She had chosen it because she believed Amos would see an envelope, not evidence. The fact that the call had come from Stephanie's office should have shocked me. Instead, it settled into place beside everything I had heard in the hospital hallway. My sister had not misunderstood a legal document or called North Coast to ask an innocent question. Someone using the main number of her company had reported my living daughter dead. Priya asked me not to contact Stephanie. North Coast was preserving the call record, but Elaine Carver could not release the full recording until the trust's fraud team completed its initial review. "She can confirm what the caller said," Priya told me. "Ivy was reported as having died yesterday morning. The caller requested the successor beneficiary packet and asked that it be sent to Juniper Vale." I looked at the clock above Ivy's bed. Yesterday morning, my daughter had been awake enough to complain that the hospital gelatin tasted like a wet envelope. What happens now? The notification opened a claim file and paused the final distribution review. It did not change the beneficiary. Judith and Stephanie cannot receive anything without certified proof of death, identity verification, and approval under the trust terms. So they failed. "They created a record," Priya corrected gently. "That may become more important than whether their first attempt worked." North Coast needed confirmation that Ivy was alive, but Priya was careful about how we provided it. She did not send medical records or details about Ivy's condition. With my written authorization, Dr. Shaw's office supplied a limited statement confirming that Ivy Whitaker was alive and currently admitted under my care as her legal parent. By early afternoon, Elaine marked the claim disputed and potentially fraudulent. The $1.8 million remained secured. No beneficiary change would be processed while North Coast reviewed the call, the courier request, and any documents submitted under Ivy's name. The money was safe for the moment. Ivy was not. Her blood pressure had fallen twice that morning. Dr. Shaw adjusted one medication and ordered another scan. I sat beside the bed while a nurse checked the line in Ivy's arm, trying not to let my eyes keep drifting toward the monitor. "You look mad," Ivy said after the nurse left. "I am worried." "That is your worried face with extra eyebrows." Her voice was weak, but the joke was hers. I touched her cheek and told her she was observant. I did not tell her that her aunt had reported her dead while she was still making fun of me. Judith and Stephanie arrived shortly after 3. My mother carried a pale blue notebook with a ribbon tied around it. Stephanie brought a paper bag from Ivy's favorite bakery, although Ivy had not been allowed solid food since the previous night. Judith placed the notebook on the bedside table. Gold letters on the cover read, "My wishes and memories." "I thought this might help you put down anything important," she said. "Things you want people to remember, special gifts, messages for the family." I moved the notebook away from Ivy's hand. "She is not writing a will." "It is not legal paperwork," Judith replied. Her tone was patient, as though I were the one making the room uncomfortable. "It is about giving her peace." Stephanie opened the bakery bag and let the smell of cinnamon fill a room where Ivy could not eat. "Caleb would treasure anything she wanted him to have. He has always cared about her." Ivy glanced at the bag, and then at her aunt. "Why does everyone keep talking about Caleb?" Stephanie's smile tightened. "Because family thinks about the people who continue after us." "Continue what?" "The opportunities we do not get to use," Judith said. I stood and picked up the notebook. "This visit is over." My mother looked offended. "We came to comfort her. You brought a book for final wishes less than 24 hours after her doctor gave me an estimate. You will not ask her about money, belongings, her room, Caleb, or what happens if she dies." Stephanie crossed her arms. "You are making something ugly out of kindness." I opened the door and held it until they left. Judith paused beside me, lowering her voice so Ivy would not hear. "You cannot protect her from reality." "No, but I can protect her from people who are trying to use it." My mother's face hardened. She followed Stephanie down the hallway without saying goodbye to Ivy. After the door closed, I threw the bakery bag away and placed the notebook inside a cabinet. Ivy watched me until I returned to the chair beside her. "Aunt Stephanie only visits when she wants to talk about Caleb," she said. "Is he in trouble?" I could not tell her about the false death report, but I would not lie again. "There are adults trying to make decisions about money that belongs to your future. You do not need to solve that. You do not need to promise anyone anything while you are sick." Ivy picked at the edge of the blanket. "If I really die, I do not want Caleb punished because his mom is weird about money." The gentleness of it hurt more than anger would have. Even now, she was trying to make her disappearance useful. I took her hand carefully, avoiding the sensor on her finger. "If that day comes, we will decide with love, but you are alive. Nobody gets to divide your future while you are still fighting for it." "What if I do want to help him?" "Then it should be your choice, made when no one is standing beside your hospital bed waiting for an answer." She nodded, but her eyes remained on our joined hands. "I do not want people to think I was selfish. You are 12 years old and fighting to stay alive. Keeping your own future is not selfish." A nurse came in to check Ivy's blood pressure. While she worked, I asked to speak with the charge nurse privately. I explained that Judith and Stephanie had pressured Ivy to discuss money and final wishes while she was critically ill. The hospital did not need details about the trust. It needed to know that 2 visitors were placing financial pressure on a minor patient. Judith and Stephanie were removed from the unrestricted visitor list. They could not enter Ivy's room without me present, and without approval from the nursing desk. When I returned, Ivy had fallen asleep. I sat beside her and wondered how many times I had mistaken access for love. I had allowed my mother and sister into our lives because I believed even imperfect relatives gave Ivy roots. Instead, I had made her stand quietly, while they measured whether she deserved the same ground as Caleb. My phone vibrated near sunset. Amos had sent 2 scanned work orders and the related email chains. 2 weeks earlier, after I told the family that Ivy's current treatment was losing effectiveness, Stephanie had contacted a company that transported mature nursery stock. No one had spoken in terms of days then. She had asked only for an estimate and their earliest available dates, which proved preparation but not yet a completed plan. The confirmed order was different. At 5:42 p.m. on April 14, less than an hour after Dr. Shaw explained the 7-day prognosis, Stephanie had booked a crew for the morning of April 21. The description read, "Verify retained nursery inventory after beneficiary transition." The second work order came from a residential moving company. Stephanie had requested a quote 2 weeks earlier for clearing a bedroom and moving boxed property into storage. At 5:49 p.m. on April 14, she confirmed the same date. Under job description, she had written, "Clear Ivy room for Caleb Rowe before summer term near Brackenridge State University." Caleb was 17. He had never asked to live in my house, and he did not know his mother had assigned him my daughter's room. I looked at the timestamps again. The plan had not begun when Judith smiled in the hallway. That was only the first moment I had seen it. They had been waiting for a reason to press send. The confirmed work orders stayed open on my phone while Ivy's blood pressure fell for the second time that night. Stephanie had booked both crews within an hour of hearing that my daughter might have only 7 days left. She had not waited for a second medical opinion, a change in treatment, or even darkness to fall before assigning Ivy's room and Beatrice's property to other people. I wanted to call her and force her to explain every line. Instead, I turned my phone face down when the nurses entered. One of them adjusted the medication supporting Ivy's heart, while another checked the line in her neck. The monitor changed from its familiar double beep to a sharper warning that made my stomach tighten. Dr. Shaw came in shortly after midnight. She studied the latest scan and blood results before pulling a chair close to mine. "The medications are still supporting her circulation," she said, "but they are not changing the process attacking her heart. Her cardiac function has declined again." "What does that mean tonight?" "It means we watch her minute by minute. It also means I want to discuss an option that was not available when we spoke yesterday." An immunology specialist joined us early the next morning. They did not present the treatment as a rescue waiting conveniently behind the next door. The drug was an immune-modulating therapy with limited adult data and only a small number of pediatric uses involving different underlying conditions. Ivy had a biomarker pattern that made the doctors believe it might interrupt the inflammation damaging her heart, but no one could predict whether her body would respond. Dr. Shaw explained that the manufacturer had agreed in principle to release a dose from a regional treatment center. The hospital still had to request emergency single-patient authorization from the FDA, complete informed consent, notify the Institutional Review Board, and arrange transport. Even if every approval came through, the drug would not reach Ivy for another 24 to 36 hours. "What happens if we do nothing?" I asked. Dr. Shaw did not soften her answer. "We continue the current support, but based on the direction of her numbers, I do not expect it to reverse the decline." "What happens if the new drug makes things worse?" "She could have a severe infusion reaction. It could increase her risk of infection or injure her liver. We would monitor closely, but I cannot promise we could reverse every complication." "Are you trying to cure her or buy time?" "At this stage, our first goal is to stop the immune attack long enough for her heart to recover some function. That may create time. Whether it becomes recovery, we do not know." I had spent the previous day learning how quickly my family could turn uncertainty into ownership. I refused to do the same thing in reverse. I would not call a possibility a miracle simply because I needed one. I asked Dr. Shaw to explain the treatment to Ivy in language she could understand. My daughter was 12, frightened and exhausted, but the choice concerned what her body might have to endure. I wanted her voice included, without making her responsible for comforting me. When Ivy woke, Dr. Shaw told her the medicine might slow the part of her immune system hurting her heart. She also explained that it could make her feel worse before anyone knew whether it was helping. Worse like throwing up? Ivy asked. Possibly. You may have fever, chills, pain, or trouble breathing during the infusion. Could I die from it? Dr. Shaw paused before answering. There is serious risk. There is also serious risk if we continue exactly as we are. Ivy looked at me. What do you want? I want you here, I said. But wanting you here does not give me the right to pretend this is easy. What if I try and it does not work? Then it does not mean you failed. Her eyes filled, though she blinked before the tears could fall. Would you be disappointed that I made everything harder for nothing? The question cut through every legal call and work order waiting on my phone. Ivy was still thinking like the 6-year-old who had kept her clothes packed because she believed care had to produce a return. I leaned closer. Loving you is not a contract. You do not owe me a result for staying beside you. She turned her face toward the window. Rain traced thin lines down the glass, and for a while the only sounds were the monitor and the soft rush of oxygen. Beatrice kept that little tree after everyone said it was dead, Ivy murmured. I remembered the Japanese maple behind the propagation house. One spring, its branches remained bare long after the others had opened. A buyer told Beatrice to remove it before a tour because it made the nursery look neglected. Beatrice had scraped a tiny section of bark near the base and found green tissue beneath it. She told Ivy that hope did not mean pretending a sick tree was healthy. It meant checking whether the roots were still alive before deciding there was nothing left to save. Ivy looked back at Dr. Shaw. If there is still a root, I want them to check. Her voice shook. She was not fearless, and she did not need to be. She chose the treatment while afraid. The next day passed in pieces measured by approvals. The manufacturer confirmed release of the drug. The FDA physician authorized emergency use through the hospital's urgent channel. Dr. Shaw reviewed the consent form with me line by line, and the hospital documented its required IRB notification. A medical courier brought the dose from the regional center late on April 17th. While we waited, Priya called with an update from North Coast. Judith and Stephanie had submitted a formal contingent beneficiary death claim after the original phone call. They both signed it, Priya said. Whose signature did they use for me? They did not use yours. They signed their own names. The document stated that they had been reliably informed Ivy Whitaker was deceased and that they were entitled to open the contingent beneficiary process. They had completed the forms through a Pennsylvania remote online notary. The platform had preserved their identification checks, IP addresses, timestamps, and the video of the notarial session. They swore she was dead? I asked. Under penalty of perjury, Priya said. They created this evidence themselves. I looked through the glass door at Ivy while the pharmacy team prepared the infusion. My mother and sister had believed that avoiding my signature protected them. Instead, they had attached their own names, faces, devices, and voices to a statement they knew was false. I told Priya to preserve everything and ended the call before Ivy saw the anger on my face. The infusion began shortly after 6. Within the first hour, Ivy developed a fever. Her teeth chattered beneath warmed blankets, and angry red patches appeared along her neck. The nurses slowed the medication while Dr. Shaw treated the reaction and watched her breathing. I held Ivy's hand as she whispered that she hated the medicine. I know, I said. You are allowed to hate it. Nothing improved that night. Her heart numbers did not rise. The fever continued, and the new drug looked less like hope than one more thing hurting her. Near dawn, Amos called. I stepped only as far as the glass wall outside Ivy's room, where I could still see her bed. A man named Graham Pike had an appraiser contact me, Amos said. They want access to Juniper Vale to inspect equipment, mother stock, and retained inventory. Is Graham connected to North Coast or the buyer? Not according to any file I have. The appraiser said Graham is a private lender. Stephanie told him she is about to control the assets. I stared at Ivy through the glass. My sister had not only planned around my daughter's death, she had already offered someone a future that had never belonged to her. The appraiser's call gave Amos another reason to treat every object at Juniper Vale as evidence rather than property waiting to be moved. He photographed the overnight envelope exactly where the courier had handed it to him, recorded the tracking number and delivery time, then placed it inside the locked inventory cabinet in Beatrice's office. The access log showed his name, the time, and the reason the cabinet had been opened. Juniper Vale was still the trust's registered administrative address because the sale had not closed. North Coast had not sent the envelope there because the caller was free to choose a hiding place. The address was already part of the closing file, and with only 10 days remaining, the trustee had used overnight delivery. Amos was authorized to accept operational mail for the property. He was not authorized to open documents concerning a beneficiary, and he followed that line exactly. Priya arranged a video call with Amos and Elaine Carver from North Coast. I joined from the small family consultation room beside Ivy's unit, keeping the glass door open so I could see anyone entering her room. Amos positioned his phone above the desk. Elaine verified the tracking number, the condition of the envelope, and the seal before instructing him to open it on camera. Inside was a formal request for additional proof of death, identity documents for the contingent beneficiaries, and instructions for completing the successor review. The cover letter stated that North Coast had opened the claim after receiving notice that Ivy Whitaker was deceased. Seeing those words printed on trust letterhead affected me differently from hearing them over the phone. A stranger inside a financial institution had typed my daughter's name beside the word deceased because my mother and sister had deliberately put it there. The packet had not transferred the inheritance. It had not made Judith or Stephanie owners of Juniper Vale. It was only a verification request, but it proved that their hospital conversation had already become an official claim. Elaine asked Amos to hold each page beneath the camera while she confirmed the document count. The reply label directed the completed packet back through North Coast's Secure Processing Center. A notation stated that the original caller had specifically requested delivery to Juniper Vale because the family was handling final matters from the property. "They told you they were at the nursery?" I asked. Elaine shook her head. "They represented Juniper Vale as the appropriate family administrative address. Our system still required certified proof before any determination." Priya told Amos to return the pages to the envelope and secure everything in the same cabinet. North Coast would send a bonded courier to collect it as part of the fraud review. Less than an hour later, Stephanie called him. Amos did not record the conversation. He wrote a contemporaneous account as soon as it ended, noting the time, duration, and exact phrases he could remember. He read it to Priya before sending a signed copy. Stephanie began by saying a private family letter had been delivered to Juniper Vale by mistake. She asked Amos to place it inside Judith's old desk drawer until someone could collect it. Amos asked for the sender's name and tracking number. Stephanie gave him North Coast's name and the final 6 digits from the courier label. North Coast's automated system had emailed that tracking number to the address used when the claim was opened. Her knowledge of it tied her directly to the request and proved she had been waiting for the envelope. Amos told her the document had already been transferred into the trust administrator's custody. That was not literally complete yet, but Elaine had assumed control of the material and instructed him how to preserve it. Stephanie's voice changed. She told him he had worked for the Mercer family too long to forget who had paid him. She said Juniper Vale would soon return to family control, and that employees who made themselves difficult during a transition rarely kept their positions afterward. Amos answered that Beatrice's trust, not Stephanie, currently employed him as site custodian. Stephanie said, "You should think carefully about which side of the gate you want to be standing on next week." Then she hung up. When Amos read that sentence aloud, I pictured him standing beside the old service gate, listening to someone who had never learned the difference between inheriting a name and earning authority. Priya asked him to review the retained asset schedule before responding to Graham Pike's appraiser. Amos already knew most of it by memory, but the exact categories mattered. The protected mother stock, breeding records, selected equipment, licensed variety files, and specific inventoried supplies remained trust property until closing. Most would transfer to the conservation buyer on April 25th. The rest would be sold or distributed, according to the agreement. None of those items formed Stephanie's personal inheritance. Even if the contingent clause were triggered, she would receive a share of the final payment, not ownership of the nursery's operating assets. The inventory list Stephanie had sent Graham's appraiser described those same assets as property she would soon control. It included greenhouse equipment, mature specimens, and breeding records she had no present or future right to pledge. She did not just exaggerate the value of her inheritance, Priya said. She described trust property as though it belonged to her. I asked whether Graham could take anything if he had relied on that description. No. Stephanie cannot give a lender rights she does not possess. Graham may have a claim against her if she misled him, but he has no lien on Juniper Vale. Amos denied the appraiser access and sent Graham a written notice identifying North Coast as the legal contact. He did not accuse anyone of fraud. He simply stated that no inspection had been authorized and no creditor held rights over the property. The nursery was protected. My house was not yet as secure as I thought. That afternoon, Amos reviewed the exterior footage from the previous day. Judith had used the spare key I once gave her for emergencies and entered my home while I was at the hospital. The front camera showed her arriving alone. 20 minutes later, she came outside holding a tape measure and photographed the width of the front door, the hallway turn, and the staircase. There were no cameras inside Ivy's bedroom. Amos had never installed any, and I would not have wanted him to. The exterior footage only showed Judith carrying several flattened boxes from her car into the house, then returning with photographs on her phone. A delivery had also been left inside the garage. The carton contained part of the new desk Stephanie ordered. A paper shipping label on the outside read Caleb Room. I called the locksmith who had serviced the house after Thomas died. By evening, I had disabled Judith's smart lock code. The locksmith scheduled the side door cylinder replacement for the following afternoon, and Priya sent Judith and Stephanie written notice that they no longer had permission to enter my home or remove any property. I did not confront my mother about the footage. I wanted her to know the permission was gone, but not how much evidence Amos had preserved. While other people secured the places Ivy might return to, the drug continued making no visible difference. 2 days after the infusion, her fever had eased, but her heart function had not improved. The doctors adjusted support, repeated tests, and warned me that the absence of immediate change did not prove failure. It also did not give us reassurance. Ivy slept through most of the afternoon. When she woke, she asked whether I had gone home at all. No, Amos is looking after everything. Her fingers moved weakly against the blanket. Is my room still there? The question was so quiet that I almost answered too quickly. Your room is exactly where you left it. What if I stay here a long time? It will still be yours. She studied my face as if promises had weight, and she was deciding whether mine could carry itself. I remembered a dinner 2 years earlier when Judith had said Caleb needed privacy because he was family, while Ivy should be grateful for whatever space she received. Ivy had gone silent. Later, I told her Grandma used old-fashioned words and did not always mean them the way they sounded. The memory stayed with me, unfinished and ugly. Now, Ivy was not only afraid she might die, she was afraid the world would begin replacing her before she was gone. I held her hand and told her no one would pack her belongings, assign her bed, or decide that her place in our home had expired. This time, the promise was backed by changed locks, written notices, preserved footage, and a man at Juniper Vale who understood that keeping watch could be an act of loyalty. Near midnight, Priya called with the first result from tracing Graham Pike. Stephanie had signed a loan memorandum 6 weeks earlier. The loan was not secured by Juniper Vale, but she had promised repayment from an asset described in her own documents as vested inheritance proceeds from Juniper Vale. Her right was not vested. It existed only if Ivy died before April 25th. The false death claim had not been a desperate idea born in a hospital hallway. It was the step Stephanie needed to make a promise to her lender come true. Graham Pike sent the loan package to Priya the next morning. Elaine Carver had already informed him that Stephanie held no present right to Juniper Vale, its equipment, or the final payment. Graham's appraiser had nearly entered property belonging to a trust based on information supplied by someone who did not own it. Providing the documents was the fastest way for him to show that he had relied on Stephanie's representations rather than knowingly participating in them. Priya called me from her office while Ivy slept. Graham's loan package confirms that Stephanie promised repayment from $900,000 she described as vested inheritance proceeds. Half of the final payment. Yes, except her interest is not vested. It exists only if Ivy dies before April 25th. Stephanie had borrowed against a death that had not happened. Priya continued carefully. There is something else in the financial statement she gave Graham. She listed a custodial brokerage account belonging to Caleb as part of the family's available liquidity. I turned toward Ivy's bed. Does that mean she borrowed against his money too? I do not know yet. The account is identified as a UTMA account. If that is accurate, the money belongs to Caleb, even though Stephanie acts as custodian until he reaches the transfer age. She can use it only for his benefit. Caleb was 17. In less than a year, he would be old enough to see every number his mother had kept from him. Priya could not simply request a minor's financial records, because his aunt was involved in a trust dispute. She contacted Mark instead, telling him only that Stephanie had listed an account owned by Caleb in a loan application, and that he should consult his own attorney before allowing anyone to treat it as family collateral. Mark called me less than 2 hours later. His voice was controlled at first. Did Stephanie use Caleb's name in something connected to Ivy? She used her expected inheritance as the repayment source. Priya told me Caleb's custodial account was also listed. She said that account was untouched. I did not know what answer he expected from me. I have never seen it. Mark took a breath that sounded painful. Neither have I. Not for almost 2 years. He had believed the statements were being delivered electronically to Stephanie because she was the custodian. She told him she had moved the account to a lower-fee platform and that the college money was growing. Whenever Caleb asked about tuition or deposits, she said everything was handled. After Priya's call, Mark contacted the brokerage and began the verification process as Caleb's father. The brokerage confirmed the account existed that afternoon, but would not release a full history to him informally. He hired a lawyer who served a formal demand for a custodial accounting. 48 hours later, the first transaction records arrived. The UTMA account had once held more than $110,000. Over the previous 2 years, Stephanie had withdrawn large amounts and transferred them into her college consulting business. Other withdrawals paid a personal credit card, overdue property taxes, and a loan tied to a vehicle Caleb had never used. Some expenses for a child could legally be paid from a custodial account if they genuinely benefited that child. Payroll for Stephanie's employees did not. Neither did her credit card or the cost of maintaining the image she sold to other parents. She spent his future, Mark said. The words were almost identical to what Judith had said about Ivy, except Mark sounded as though he had finally understood what they meant. One set of transfers caught his lawyer's attention. More than $20,000 had moved first into Judith's account under the description Family Bridge. Within days, most of it went to Stephanie's company. My mother had not merely discovered Stephanie's crisis in the hospital hallway. She had already helped hide it. Mark told Caleb only what his lawyer believed he needed to know. Stephanie had used money belonging to him, listed his account in a private loan application, and was involved in an attempt to claim Ivy's inheritance. I was not present when he told him. Mark called me afterward because Caleb wanted one question answered, and Mark did not know how to answer it himself. Did she need Ivy to die before she could tell me what she did? I closed my eyes. No, I said. She could have told him the truth at any time. That is not what he meant. I knew. Caleb was asking whether his mother had needed another child's death to replace the future she had taken from him. Mark's voice cracked for the first time. He thought she was helping him apply for scholarships because she wanted him to be independent. Now he knows she was afraid someone would ask to see the account. Caleb did not offer to help me punish his mother. He did not ask for Ivy's money. Through his lawyer, and with Mark present, he signed a short statement saying he had not authorized Stephanie to use his name or account in any loan request, knew nothing about the false death claim, and did not consent to receiving property intended for Ivy. I told Priya not to place Caleb in front of Judith or Stephanie unless the legal process required it. He was another child whose future had been treated as a tool by the adults claiming to protect him. I would not turn him into my witness, simply because his mother had turned him into her excuse. That evening, Ivy's numbers stopped falling. Dr. Shah showed me the trend without smiling. Her heart function had not recovered, but it had not worsened during the previous 12 hours. One medication supporting her blood pressure had been reduced slightly. Is the treatment working? I asked. It may be changing the inflammatory process, she said. Stability is encouraging, but it is not recovery. We need more time. I held on to the distinction. Ivy was still critically ill. She still needed oxygen, continuous monitoring, and medications that could not be stopped. I did not call Judith or Stephanie. Their access to medical updates had ended when they used my daughter's prognosis as a financial opportunity. When Ivy woke, she noticed something in my face. Did something happen? Your numbers did not get worse today. She looked toward the monitor. That sounds like a very careful way to say good news. It is the amount of good news we have. She accepted that more easily than I did. After a few minutes, she asked whether Caleb knew about the inheritance. He knows his name was used in things he did not agree to. Was he helping his mom? No. Her shoulders relaxed against the pillow. Does he still get to go to college? His father and a lawyer are protecting what remains and finding out what happened. Caleb will have choices, even if they are not the choices his mother promised him. Ivy stared at the blanket. I just do not want him to think I took something from him. You did not. His mother took from both of you in different ways. Near sunset, Priya forwarded a message from Graham Pike. He had suspended any additional funding to Stephanie, but he still intended to document the condition of the property she had represented in his loan package. His attorney had arranged for an inventory team to arrive at Juniper Vale on the morning of April 21st. They had been instructed not to touch anything, and to remain outside the gate unless North Coast authorized entry. That was the same morning Stephanie had booked the nursery transport crew. It was also the morning her movers were scheduled to clear Ivy's bedroom. The 7th day was no longer only a medical deadline. It had become the point where 3 separate plans were about to collide around a child. Everyone but me had already treated as absent. By the afternoon of April 20th, Priya had reduced the next morning to a set of rules simple enough for Amos to follow without guessing. Every contractor who arrived at Juniper Vale would show a work order and sign the gate log. No truck would cross the service entrance without Elaine Carver's written approval. Nothing listed on the retained asset schedule could leave the property before closing, not a mother plant, a file box, or a piece of equipment. Amos was not to argue, threaten, or encourage anyone to make a mistake. His job was to preserve the boundary, not create a trap. My house required a separate boundary. Priya had already sent Judith and Stephanie written notice that their permission to enter had been revoked. I changed the smart lock codes from the hospital, but the old side door still used a metal key. The locksmith could not replace that cylinder until the following afternoon, and Judith had never returned the spare I had given her years earlier. If either of them uses that key now, it is not a family misunderstanding, Priya said. You have withdrawn consent in writing, Amos calls the police and does not enter the house alone. I hated that my mother knew the shape of my home well enough to exploit one unfinished lock. Priya reminded me that knowing where a door was did not give Judith the right to open it. Elaine joined our call from North Coast and confirmed that the original death notification had been recorded under the company's standard call monitoring policy. The caller had identified herself as Stephanie Rowe. She said Ivy had died after a prolonged illness and asked that the contingent beneficiary claim be opened immediately so the family would not miss the April 25th closing date. My mother had come onto the line before the call ended. Elaine did not play the recording for me. She read the verified summary prepared by the fraud team. Judith gave her full name, confirmed her relationship to Ivy, and stated that my daughter had passed away after a long and painful decline. She then asked whether the final payment could be redirected without delaying the Juniper Vale transaction. I watched Ivy sleeping through the glass wall beside the consultation room. Her chest rose unevenly beneath the blanket, while my mother's recorded voice sat inside a corporate file describing her as dead. "Can we send them the recording?" I asked. "No," Priya said. "We preserve it. We do not use it to provoke a confession or frighten them into destroying something else." She was right. Though part of me wanted Judith to hear her own lie while Ivy's monitor sounded in the background. Priya's goal was to stop the claim, protect the property, and let their choices remain exactly as they had made them. Revenge would have been easier to feel. Restraint was harder and more useful. Elaine confirmed that North Coast had frozen the false claim and attached proof that Ivy was alive. The recording, notarial file, courier request, and electronic claim would remain restricted until the trustee and council determined the next legal steps. Judith and Stephanie still did not know how much North Coast had preserved. After the call, Dr. Shaw came into Ivy's room with the cautious expression I had learned not to mistake for celebration. Ivy had remained stable long enough for the team to reduce one of the medications supporting her blood pressure. She was awake for longer stretches and needed slightly less oxygen, but her heart was still fragile. "This is movement in the right direction," Dr. Shaw said. "It is not the end of the danger." April 21st would mark the point Dr. Shaw had once feared Ivy's body might not survive. For the first time, her numbers suggested it might. When we were alone, Ivy asked why I kept leaving the room to speak with lawyers. I had tried to protect her by limiting what she knew, but silence had begun to resemble the same thing I had done for years whenever Judith insulted her gently enough to deny it later. I sat beside the bed and told her the part she had a right to understand. "Grandma and Aunt Stephanie have acted as if you are no longer alive," I said. "They contacted the people managing Beatrice's trust. They also made plans for your room and Juniper Vale." Ivy did not cry. Her face became still in the way it had when Judith brought the notebook of final wishes. "Did you believe it?" she asked. "Believe what?" "That I was going to die, even for a minute." The honest answer frightened me more than the kind one. "Yes," I said. "I was terrified it could happen. But being afraid is not the same as deciding you are already gone." She looked toward the window. "They decided." "Yes." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. Maybe they were trying not to waste things. The sentence sounded like my mother, but the shame beneath it belonged to Ivy. I had heard versions of it when she apologized for needing new shoes, medical appointments, or a room no one else could use. "I need to tell you something I should have said years ago," I told her. "When Grandma or Aunt Stephanie made you feel like an outsider, I often asked you to ignore it because I wanted everyone to stay together. I made their comfort more important than telling the truth about what they were doing. You said they were old-fashioned. I said that because it was easier than admitting they were hurting you. I'm sorry." She studied my face as though apologies, like promises, needed testing. "I thought if I did not complain, you would not have to choose. I should have chosen without making you ask." Her eyes filled then, but she did not look away. I told her she did not need to be quieter, cheaper, easier, or more grateful to keep a place in my life. No one who required her to become smaller deserved to be protected from the consequences of losing her. She was silent for a while, before saying she still did not want Caleb to lose college because of what Stephanie had done. "You can care about him," I said. "That does not mean you must repair everything his mother broke." Ivy swallowed and looked down at our hands. "I do not want him to lose his future." Then she lifted her eyes to mine. "But I do not have to lose mine first." The words were simple enough for a 12-year-old and strong enough to change the room. For the first time, Ivy's compassion did not end with her removing herself from the picture. While she rested, Amos prepared Juniper Vale for the morning. He checked the warehouse locks, tested the gate cameras, and compared the mother stock rows against the inventory Elaine already had. He sent North Coast a copy of the gate log template and confirmed that the nursery hauler, Graham's inventory team, and any unexpected contractor would remain outside until their authority was verified. He did not move anything to make the property look suspicious. He did not hide files or arrange witnesses. He made sure the place remained exactly as the trust required because the truth did not need staging. At 8:36 that evening, Judith texted me. "Stephanie and I will help take care of things at the house tomorrow. You need to focus on the hospital." I did not answer. Priya added the message to the preservation file. An hour later, Amos sent me a clip from the Juniper Vale gate camera. Judith's car had stopped outside the property long enough for Stephanie to walk around to the passenger side. The video had no useful audio, but the image was clear. My mother placed a metal key in Stephanie's palm, and Stephanie closed her fingers around it. Amos had ignored her next call on Priya's instruction. Stephanie left a voicemail instead. Her voice was calm, almost cheerful. "By tomorrow night, Caleb's things will be in that room, and this family can finally move forward." I listened once, then forwarded the file to Priya without replying. My sister believed an empty room would make her lie feel true. She had no idea the child she was trying to erase had just decided to keep her future. At 8:04 on the morning of April 21st, Dr. Shaw stood beside Ivy's bed studying the overnight trend on the monitor while Amos called from the gate at Juniper Vale. "There are 3 vehicles outside," he said. Judith's car, a white van from Pike Asset Verification, and the nursery transport truck Stephanie booked. Before I could answer, another notification appeared from the camera at my house. A moving van had stopped at the curb. The 7th day had arrived exactly as Stephanie had planned it, even though Ivy was still breathing beside me. Dr. Shaw touched my shoulder and told me to take the call. I stepped no farther than the glass wall outside Ivy's room. Through it, I could see a nurse adjusting the blanket over her legs. "Follow Priya's instructions," I told Amos. "Do not let anyone move anything. I have the gate closed. Everyone is signing in." Amos asked each driver for identification, recorded their license plates and arrival times, then collected copies of their work orders. He did not ask why they had come. He let their own documents answer that. Stephanie's nursery hauler had been instructed to remove selected mother plants, breeding files, and greenhouse equipment after a beneficiary transition. Graham Pike's appraiser carried a list of assets copied from Stephanie's loan package. The movers at my house had orders to clear Ivy's room and place the contents in storage. Judith and Stephanie approached the gate together. Amos called me again before speaking with them, because Stephanie was holding a North Coast claim acknowledgement as though it were a deed. I could hear her voice through his phone. "My niece died after a long illness. My mother and I are the contingent beneficiaries. We are taking control so the closing is not delayed." The gate log included a routine line marked "Purpose of Visit." Stephanie took the pen and wrote, "Successor, beneficiary transition after Ivy Whitaker's death." My hand tightened around the phone. Ivy had opened her eyes inside the room. She could see me through the glass, but she could not hear her aunt announce her death to strangers. Judith's voice followed, softer and more practiced. "Rebecca is devastated. We are trying to spare her from handling practical matters." Amos answered without raising his own voice. "Grief does not transfer title, ma'am. Neither does being related to the owner." Stephanie told him the acknowledgement proved North Coast had accepted their claim. Amos read the page and pointed out that it only confirmed receipt. It did not say the claim had been approved, the final payment had been released, or anyone had gained authority over trust property. The appraiser asked to examine the mother's stock and variety records so Graham could verify the assets Stephanie had listed in her loan file. Amos placed Elaine Carver on speakerphone. Elaine identified herself as the North Coast officer overseeing the trust and told the appraiser that Stephanie had no ownership interest in Juniper Vale's retained assets. No lender, creditor, claimant, or contingent beneficiary had permission to inspect or value the property for a personal loan. The appraiser stopped immediately. He gave Amos a copy of his work order and remained outside the gate while he called Graham's attorney. Later, Priya forwarded me the email, confirming that Graham had suspended all activity connected to the nursery. I did not know what he thought when he learned Stephanie had misrepresented the property, and I did not need to imagine it. His written withdrawal was enough. When Stephanie realized the nursery gate would not open, she turned toward my house. Amos called while following at a distance in his own truck. The movers are heading there too. I have notified the police that people whose access was revoked may attempt to enter. Do not go inside alone. I won't. Dr. Shaw stepped through the consultation room door as I ended the call. Her expression held caution, but not the guarded dread I had seen all week. Ivy's cardiac function has improved enough for us to reduce another support medication, she said. Her inflammatory markers are also moving down. Is she out of danger? Out of the immediate decline we feared 7 days ago. That is not the same as recovered. Her heart is still injured, and the next weeks will matter. I looked at Ivy through the glass. For the first time that week, the direction had changed. I went back to Ivy's bedside. She was too weak to sit up, but her eyes followed me. Was that good news? She asked. It was careful good news. That is still your favorite kind. I smiled, though my phone began vibrating again before I could answer. The exterior camera showed Stephanie using the metal key Judith had given her. Both women had received written notice that they no longer had permission to enter, but Stephanie unlocked the side door anyway. The movers remained outside at first. Their work order stated that the homeowner had approved access and that the room had been vacated. Amos arrived before they carried in the first set of boxes. I knew the rest only from what Amos told me afterward. The gate and camera logs, the movers' written statements, and the police report. I did not see it happen, and I would not pretend I had. Amos told the crew that I had not authorized the job. The supervisor stopped his men and asked Stephanie to contact me directly. Stephanie refused. She said I was too emotionally unstable to speak and ordered the movers to proceed. Amos stepped between the doorway and the first empty carton. He did not touch anyone. He told them the house was my private property. Permission had been revoked in writing, and no item could be removed without my direct consent. Judith said she was my mother and had possessed a key for years. Amos replied that an old key was not current permission. Stephanie walked upstairs and tried Ivy's bedroom door. It was locked. She demanded that the movers force it open or remove the hinges. The supervisor refused. Stephanie pointed at the door and said, "That room does not have an owner anymore." Amos called the police then, not because of the inheritance dispute, but because 2 people had entered a private home after written revocation and were refusing to leave. The officers did not arrest anyone on the spot. They separated the parties, confirmed through Priya that I was the owner, reviewed the written notice, and stopped all movement of property. They collected copies of the work order and photographed the old key. Judith and Stephanie were escorted outside while the movers removed only the empty cartons they had brought with them. Nothing in Ivy's room was touched. Judith called me before the officers had finished their report. Her voice shook with fury. "You let a gardener call the police on your own mother. They humiliated us in front of strangers." I looked at Ivy, who had fallen asleep again with more color in her face than she had the day before. "You told strangers. My daughter was dead so you could empty her room," I said. "Do not call what happened to you humiliation." Judith began to say Stephanie had only been preparing, but I ended the call. I did not need another version of a lie already preserved in forms, recordings, work orders, and the words they had spoken at the gate. When Ivy woke later, I told her only what she needed to know. Juniper Vale was secure. Her room was locked. No one had taken anything. "Did Amos stop them?" she asked. "He kept the gate until the people with legal authority could do their jobs." She closed her eyes again. "Tell him thank you." That afternoon, Elaine sent the formal notice. North Coast had closed the current false death claim because Ivy was alive and the reported death was untrue. The notice carefully stated that Judith and Stephanie's contingent rights would not technically expire until Ivy remained alive at 5 o'clock on April 25th. The money had never left the trust. But the signed claim, the recorded call, and the evidence gathered that morning had already left my mother and sister's control. North Coast's legal department had forwarded the file to the appropriate authorities for review. At 5 o'clock on April 25th, Ivy was alive. She was still in the cardiac unit, still weak, and still dependent on medication, but she had survived the fixed date, written into Beatrice's trust. North Coast received the final installment from the Juniper Vale sale and transferred the $1.8 million into the protected subtrust created for Ivy. Judith and Stephanie's contingent interests expired at that moment. There was no appeal to emotion, no family vote, and no opportunity to argue that they had expected a different outcome. The condition had been simple. Ivy had to be alive at 5 o'clock, and she was. North Coast convened a confidential claim resolution and settlement conference 3 weeks later, after Ivy was stable enough for me to leave the hospital for several hours. Priya sat beside me at one end of a conference table in North Coast's regional office. Elaine Carver joined us with 2 members of the Trust's legal department. Judith and Stephanie had separate counsel. Mark attended with the attorney, handling his financial separation and Caleb's custodial account. Amos sat near the door with a folder containing the original gate logs. He had not come to accuse anyone. Elaine needed him only to confirm the dates, signatures, deliveries, and work orders he had personally received. Priya organized the conference around 3 questions. The first was who had reported Ivy dead. Elaine displayed the April 14th claim, the remote notary certificate, the identification records, and the preserved session video. Stephanie's lawyer objected when Elaine called the document sworn, but the form itself said both signers had affirmed the information under penalty of perjury. Then, Elaine played enough of the recorded call for Stephanie's voice to identify Ivy as deceased and for Judith to confirm it. My mother stared at the table while her own words filled the room. The second question was why they needed the claim to become true. Graham Pike's loan memorandum showed that Stephanie had promised repayment from $900,000 she called vested inheritance proceeds. Mark's attorney placed the UTMA accounting beside it. The records showed money transferred from Caleb's account into Stephanie's business, personal debts, and a family bridge that passed through Judith's account. The third question was what they had done before any right existed. Amos confirmed the courier packet, tracking details, work orders, and gate logs he personally received. One crew had been sent toward trust property Stephanie did not own. Another had been sent to clear Ivy's room. The police report established that Judith and Stephanie entered my house after their permission had been revoked. Each answer came from a different source, but together they left almost no space for an innocent explanation. Stephanie leaned toward the table. "The doctor said the child had a week." Dr. Shaw had called Ivy my daughter every time she entered the room. Stephanie still chose the child when she needed distance. "She said Ivy might have as little as a week if nothing changed," I replied. "She did not authorize you to report her dead." "I was preparing for what everyone knew was coming. You borrowed money before the prognosis." Her face tightened. Stephanie turned toward Mark. "Everything I did was for Caleb. His future was disappearing, and there was money sitting there that Ivy might never use." Mark's attorney placed the UTMA accounting on the table. The account had belonged to Caleb. Stephanie had been its custodian, not its owner. The record showed transfers to her business, her personal credit card, overdue property taxes, and a vehicle loan. More than $20,000 had passed through Judith's account before reaching Stephanie. Caleb's signed statement was only one page. He said he had not authorized the use of his name or custodial assets in the Graham Pike loan. He had not known about the false death claim and did not consent to receiving money intended for Ivy. He was not in the room. Mark had protected him from becoming part of a confrontation created by adults. Stephanie read the statement twice. "I was trying to save his college plans," she said. Mark looked at her with an exhaustion that had replaced anger. "You did not save them. You hid what you had already done." Judith finally spoke. "Beatrice was emotional when she changed the trust. Ivy may never be able to use all that money. Stephanie has a son who is healthy, capable, and preparing for college." There it was again, the calculation beneath every soft phrase. "You did not see a dying child," I told her. "You saw a condition in a trust that might soon be triggered." My mother's eyes filled. "I saw one daughter about to lose everything. You had 2 daughters in that hospital. One of us was watching her child fight for her life. The other was waiting to inherit from her." Judith began to cry. She said she had been afraid Stephanie would lose her business, her marriage, and Caleb's respect. She said families made impossible choices when they were desperate. Priya did not argue with her. Desperation could explain why someone crossed a line. It did not erase the line or the steps taken afterward. Elaine confirmed the trust consequences. The false claim was closed, the contingent rights had expired, and the $1.8 million had passed into Ivy's protected subtrust under Beatrice's terms. North Coast would ask the court to shift reasonable expenses caused by the materially false claim under the trust's cost provision. Elaine made clear that the court, not North Coast, would decide whether Judith and Stephanie had to reimburse those costs. The recorded call, sworn claim, and related records had been sent to the appropriate authorities for review. The entry into my house and attempted removal of property remained a separate matter. No one promised an arrest, conviction, or prison sentence that day. Graham had declared Stephanie in default and filed a civil claim based on misrepresentations in her loan application. Mark's lawyer had obtained a temporary financial restraining order in the separation case, preventing Stephanie from moving additional marital assets while the court reviewed the accounts. The brokerage had opened a formal accounting of Caleb's UTMA funds, and Mark was seeking restitution on his behalf. Stephanie's company had not vanished overnight. It was losing clients as civil filings became public and families began requesting refunds. The business she built by promising to protect children's futures was now being asked to explain what she had done to 2 children's money. Judith's charity had placed her on temporary suspension, pending an internal investigation. The board had not issued a final decision, but she no longer represented them at meetings or fundraising events. None of those consequences came from a post I wrote or a campaign I started. They came from forms Judith and Stephanie signed, calls they made, money Stephanie moved, and doors they chose to open. After the meeting, Judith followed me into the hallway. "Rebecca, please." I was afraid our family would lose everything. I looked back at the closed conference room door. "You decided Ivy was not family until her death could pay you. That is not what I meant. It is what you did." I left without offering forgiveness, a future conversation, or a condition she could satisfy to regain access. Ivy's recovery was not a waiting room where my mother could sit until I became tired enough to let her back in. When I returned to the hospital, a physical therapist was helping Ivy sit upright at the edge of the bed. Her arms trembled from the effort, and the therapist kept one hand near her shoulder without doing the work for her. My phone vibrated. Judith had sent one final message. I was trying to save the child who still had a future. I looked at Ivy, breathing hard, as she held herself upright for 5 more seconds than she had managed that morning. Then I deleted the message without answering. 5 months after my mother began counting down the days to Ivy's death, my daughter stood in the middle of her bedroom and pulled the old travel bag from beneath her bed. She was thinner than she had been before the hospital, and the medication left her tired by early afternoon. She still attended cardiac rehabilitation twice a week, saw Dr. Shah regularly, and completed most of her schoolwork from home. Climbing the stairs required a pause at the landing, but she climbed them without anyone carrying her. The bag had remained packed through every foster home before us. Even after Thomas and I adopted her, Ivy kept it beneath the bed with 2 shirts, socks, a toothbrush, and the small notebook containing every address where she had lived. She unzipped it and began removing the clothes. "Do these still fit?" I asked. "Not really." She folded them anyway. Then she placed the empty bag beside the bedroom door. "I do not want it under my bed anymore," she said. I did not tell her what the moment meant. She did not need me turning it into a speech. I carried the bag to the storage closet, placed it on the highest shelf, and left the door unlocked in case she ever wanted to see it again. Nothing else in her room had moved. The boxes Stephanie ordered for Caleb had been returned to the supplier. The moving company canceled its invoice after receiving the police report and my written refusal of the job. Ivy's books remained on the same shelves. Thomas's photograph still sat beside her lamp. Even the pencil she had left across her desk before the ambulance arrived was where Amos found it. That afternoon, I drove Ivy to Juniper Vale for the first time since she came home. The sale had closed months earlier. The conservation group now operated the main greenhouses and propagation buildings, while a smaller section of the property had been preserved under Beatrice's agreement. Her old office remained beside the demonstration garden, and several of the mother plants she had protected were still growing under the care of the new staff. Amos worked there 3 days a week during the transition. We found him checking irrigation valves near the service gate, wearing the same faded cap he had worn for years. Ivy walked slowly toward him. Amos noticed the way she measured each step, but did not rush forward to steady her. He waited until she reached the bench beside the gate, then sat with her as though neither of them had anywhere else to be. "Mom told me what you did," Ivy said. Amos glanced at me. "Your mother has a habit of making ordinary work sound dramatic. You kept them out." I followed the inventory list, checked the paperwork, and kept the gate closed when the paperwork was wrong. "You kept my room too." "That was a different gate," Ivy smiled. "Thank you anyway." Amos looked toward the greenhouses. People think protection always looks like standing in front of something. Most of the time, it looks like writing down the right license plate, keeping a receipt, or refusing to lose a key. Ivy considered that. Beatrice would have liked that answer. She would have corrected my grammar first. The laugh that escaped Ivy was quiet, but it sounded more like her than anything I had heard since the hospital. We walked through the preserved section at her pace. The nursery no longer belonged to our family, but Beatrice's work had not vanished. The labels Ivy helped replace as a child were still attached to several propagation beds. The place continued without needing Judith or Stephanie to control it. The protected subtrust was already helping with rehabilitation services insurance, did not fully cover, and with Ivy's return to school. It gave her choices without turning the inheritance into proof that she mattered. Beatrice had chosen Ivy long before the sale, the trust, or the final payment. The inheritance recorded that relationship. It had not created it. When we returned home, Mark's car was waiting at the curb. Caleb came inside carrying a narrow cardboard tube. Stephanie was not with them. By then, Mark had temporary control over what remained of Caleb's custodial account while the court reviewed the missing funds. Stephanie's business had closed after months of canceled contracts, refund demands, legal expenses, and clients who no longer trusted her with their children's futures. Graham Pike's civil case was still pending. The bridge loan had gone into default, and Stephanie faced a separate accounting and restitution claim over the UTMA withdrawals. No judge had ended every dispute with a single dramatic ruling. Consequences arrived as deadlines, depositions, invoices, and facts she could no longer hide. Judith's charity completed its investigation and removed her from the board. She was not allowed to contact Ivy directly. Any letter had to pass through Priya first. She had sent 3. I had read them and stored them with the legal records. Each contained regret, but none clearly admitted that she had wanted Ivy's death to occur before April 25th. I had not responded. I did not promise myself that I would forgive her later. Healing was not a calendar anyone else could write for me. Caleb handed Ivy the cardboard tube. Inside was a copy of the room sketch Stephanie had given the moving company. It showed Ivy's furniture removed and a new desk placed beneath her window. Caleb's name had been written across the top. It surfaced in the documents Mom had to produce during the UTMA accounting, he said. I thought you should decide whether to keep it or throw it away. Ivy studied the drawing without unfolding it completely. Did you know about the room? No. Mom told me you had offered to let me stay here if I went to Brackenridge State. I did not. I know that now. He sat in the chair beside her desk. He looked older than he had 5 months earlier, though perhaps he had simply stopped trusting adults to keep difficult truths from him. I am applying to 2 public universities closer to Dad, he said. I can commute for the first year. I have some money left, and I am looking at grants and campus jobs. You should not have to fix everything alone, Ivy said. I am not. Dad is helping. His lawyer is helping. I just wanted you to know I am not waiting for your trust. Ivy rolled the drawing back into the tube. You never asked them to do it. No. Then you do not owe me an apology for what they did. Caleb looked relieved, but Ivy did not offer him money, or promise to repair the account Stephanie had emptied. She gave him something more honest. She separated him from his mother's choices without taking responsibility for solving them. After Mark and Caleb left, Ivy's school counselor joined us by video call. She had prepared a return plan for the following semester, with shortened days, elevator access, rest periods, emergency instructions, and permission to complete some assignments from home. The form also listed Ivy's course choices. The counselor suggested general science because of the time Ivy had missed. Ivy asked whether she could take environmental science instead. She also chose an introductory spatial design class that covered rooms, public spaces, and accessibility. That may be a demanding combination, the counselor said. I know. We can review it after the first month. That is fair. The counselor moved to the final page. 2 lines waited at the bottom, one marked parent or guardian signature and the other student signature. I signed the first line, then held the pen for a moment. For 7 days, my mother and sister had discussed Ivy's future as though it were property waiting for an available name. They had reported her dead, divided her inheritance, scheduled her bedroom, and promised her place to someone else. I turned the pen and offered it to my daughter. The next line is yours, I said. You heard the options, you choose. Ivy read the plan once more. Her hand still trembled slightly from the months of treatment, so she rested her wrist against the desk before writing. On the line marked student signature, she wrote Ivy Whitaker in careful blue letters. They had counted down to the day her future would belong to them. Ivy signed her name, and it belonged to her.